It's 2:30. I'm Jack Franks, and we're going to be talking about Drupal 8 Migrate and how it's not rocket science, but we're playing with a lot of space data, so we'll make it as close to rocket science as we can get. Who am I? I've been doing this forever. I've only been doing Drupal for 5 years. I work for Breakthrough Technologies in Chicago, and what keeps me going in all of this is you. I love this Drupal community and who we are and what we do. For background for me, before I started really getting open sourcey, I did .NET forever. And any .NET group is just 150 guys who look exactly like me, doing exactly the same thing. And what I love is coming here and not having that. I'm primarily a back-end developer. As you can see from the real stellar design of these slides, like I'll lay stuff out or put colors on something if I have to, but that's not my jam. If I could do everything from the command line, I would be really happy. I am an active contributor to a bunch of things, including Migrate. I've taken some tests and paid for those. And then I could talk about puppets for a long time, and Pepe is definitely the best one. I'll give you points if you say Kermit, that's fine, but he's not as good as Pepe. I'm not taking questions about this. What we're going to be talking about today is migration. A brief overview of how Migrate works, the contrib modules that you really need to have in order to be super productive, how to write source plugins and what they do, how to write process plugins and what they do, how to write destination plugins and what they do, and then a whole bunch of live demos. And again, this is all space stuff, so it's really fascinating, and it'll all work. What we're not talking about today is upgrading sites with Migrate. There are a bunch of other good talks about that. We're not going to be talking at all about moving from D6 or D7 into D8. We're not talking about any of that. This is cool tricks you can do with Migrate to take data from various sources and bring it into your system and do stuff with it. We're not going to be talking about differences between Drupal 7 Migrate and Drupal 8 Migrate. I mean, there are things I'm sure that I will rant about and describe how much better they are today, but that's not really what we're talking about. And we're not doing anything multilingual. Again, there's a bunch of good multilingual talks. I don't have a list of them right now. I should probably put that together. But doing content migrations with multi-language stuff turned on could be the subject of an entire talk by itself, and maybe I'll do that. So we talked this morning about stalling. Maybe I'll write a blog post about that. So what is Migrate and how does it work? Before we really get going on this, has anyone done any migrations at all? All right, have any of these migrations come from sources other than other Drupal sites? Excellent. Okay, good. So this is how that works. Migrate really is composed of 3 parts. There's a source. This is where your data comes from. The process. This is where you map and transform your data and get it ready to go into the destination, which is where your data will end up. For the very most of use cases, destination is going to be Drupal entities. Most of the time you're using Migrate to ingest data into your site. Now, you don't always have to do it that way. You can use it for exports too, and we'll go into this. But for the most part, your destination is going to be some derivation of a Drupal object, entity. So let's look at what a migration actually looks like. Here's some code. Is this big enough to read?
Yeah.
Good. Here's some kind of nonsense stuff, language, status, ID, tagging. And then when we get into source, see I'm moving my oh no, you can't see it. Good, all right. We can see we have a particular plugin. This identifies where our source data is coming from and how that's processed. I'm using Migrate Source Directory right now. This is a plugin that walks a directory tree hierarchically and recurses down as far as you'll let it go, and has you can filter out file extensions that you want. It'll return all of those in an array of migratable data. This is a real good example source to follow here. We'll dive into this one in a little bit. So we can see that we're using this directory plugin. URLs, this is the fully qualified path as to where these belong. So it's under our web root, modules, custom, migrate PDFs data. We're only looking for PDFs, and we will infinitely recurse. There's only one level in here anyway. There's no subdirectories, but if there were, we could walk down them. Now for process, we're going to set a title, and that's going to be equal to the file name. And this is just the pathless file name of whatever the PDF is that we're ingesting here. And then we're setting the body value to the results of this parse PDF plugin with the source of the URL. URL comes from our directory plugin and is the path to the file. So it passes it into parse PDF, which then opens it, extracts text, and it will write it out to body value. Again, we'll get into this a little bit deeper in a bit too. Then we're writing this out to our destination, which is a node entity, and we're identifying this as a document bundle. Migrate Plus lets you do this, which is one huge reason for using Migrate Plus. You can enforce module dependencies so that when you enable your module and it imports the config, so it will create this migration. When you disable the module, now this will remove it from the system. If you're not using a Migrate Plus migration, it will just stay out there until you delete it. So this is very helpful. And then we don't have any other migration dependencies like related entities or anything like that. This is just grabbing one straight shot. So everyone ready to do migrates now? Good. So what we really need is, for the most part, stuff you already have. Migrate's in core, but to be super productive with it, you need some tools. Migrate Plus gives you a whole bunch of extra stuff. It gives you a bunch of extra plugins, processes that you can use, different sources, and again, it lets you use that upgraded migration type, which will enforce module dependencies. Migrate Tools is something that, Migrate does have a UI now, but it's still not brilliant. Migrate Tools is what lets you, it integrates with Drush, it gives you command line options. I would say this is an absolute must-have. I'm surprised that it hasn't made it into core already. And then stuff that makes migrating way easier is Migrate Devel. This does two things in that it will export, as you're running through Drush, it will basically print out what your source and destination look like post-map. So that you can see how it all puts together. Again, we'll get into this in a little bit. And then config update, since migrations are managed through config entities, when you make a change, most of the time you're making a change to your config in your module, disabling your module, re-enabling your module. That does get tedious, but that is the source control way to do it, which is the way I recommend. If you're skipping the source control way to do it, you could just do a config update, copy your YAML, paste it into the box, make your changes, and re-import it. It does speed things up, but it is so easy to lose stuff if you do that, so I recommend not. So how do we get going? Well, we need a module. Now again, this is my preferred way to do it. You can edit your config straight in your config directory and then just re-import. Again, I strongly recommend against doing that. It's much easier to isolate your changes this way, and you're working in a reusable module. So to create a module, you just need a directory and an info.yaml file, or if you're using Drupal console, the Drupal generate module will do it. Create a config install directory, and in here, you're going to create a migration group, and then your actual migration. And then you enable the module, see your Drush migrate status, and use a Drush migrate import to actually run it. Testing migrations is tricky. With everything you get out of the box, without actually debugging and stepping through the migration code, you have no way of identifying what your source is looking like when it comes in. So Migrate Devel can help, but you have to do that on the command line. I've written a little helper module. There's a tinycc link to the GitHub repo where all of this is, so you can copy this down. It's also in the talk description on the Twin Cities camp site. And now we can see how this works. So I have here a migration. Oops. Is that readable? I'll take that as a yes. Where I am importing some Meteorite landing data from NASA. This is a CSV, and that means that we have pretty good visibility into what this is going to look like. But let's see anyway. Let's run this, and we can run this little process row function. Say we only want to process one row of it, and that we're not actually running it through the mapping and processing function. This is only going to display the source. Let's open that up. We can see that we have a migrate row. And now here are all the fields inside the source that we have. So we've got a name, a unique ID, this name type, meteorite class, the mass, what kind of fall type it was, when, and the geo-coordinates of when that happened. So again, for something simple like a CSV, you know what this is going to look like because you've mapped out these fields. For something like a JSON service import where you've got nested hierarchical data, you don't always know how it's going to pull that in. Sometimes it will actually return you an element as an array, and it will be nicely iterable with subprocess or something like that. Sometimes it tacks on and makes every element of the array its own item, and that is not super iterable. Without getting in here and looking at how the source data works, it is a lot of just blind trial and error, and that wastes a lot of time. So use something like this, look at what your source data looks like, and then start mapping it. So let's look at sources. What a source plugin does is it gets data. I rarely have to write a custom, completely from scratch source. There's a source for pretty much everything that you want to get. JSON, off of files or web services, CSVs. We just looked at the directory, which gives you a file list from a directory structure. Of course, different versions of Drupal. You can do it straight from MySQL tables. There's all kinds of stuff you can do here. There are times when you will extend an existing source plugin in order to do something like authentication. For instance, a Spotify import URL. It needs you to authenticate on each pull. So you're extending a JSON source in order to get that. But writing from scratch, I've done it for fun, but I don't know that I've ever actually had to do it. Let's go and take one apart. So using that migrate source directory and its directory plugin is a good pattern to follow. It shows you how it all works in a real concrete way. You need a couple of things to make any source plugin work. You have to provide an initialize iterator function, a fields function, which returns an array of all of the fields that your source is returning, and then this getIDs function, which is metadata about how to uniquely identify each row that comes back. So let's have a look at that. There we go. Just tab back over. All right, well, I don't know what it's got this space on the side here for. All right, so here is what a source plugin looks like. You have your normal annotation. You're decorating it to look like a migrate source. You give it an ID and this source module, which is something that migrate just wants. And we're extending a source plugin base. Here's some stuff about how it works, recursion level, the file list, what it allowed extensions. We're going to show how to parse those in a moment. The constructors, which, just read out the config setup in your YAML file. And then initialize iterator. So really, this is where the magic happens. We're looking for each URL included, and again, this URL is something we defined in the configuration. This is a directory that we're searching through, and it's going to recurse through every file and every directory in here up to the maximum recursion level for each file that matches the list of extensions that we've allowed, and then it adds it into this array. It gives the path, which is really just the directory name, the file name, which is only the file name, and then the URL, which is both of those put together, fully qualified name. And then it returns this array iterator. Now here's something to watch out for. You have to return an iterator from a source plugin. The documentation says it will take an array. It will not. If you only return an array here, it will always come up 0. It'll always tell you there's no source data. I have spent an embarrassing amount of minutes trying to figure out why some particular source plugin is returning no data when I walk through and I can see that it's there. You need to return an iterator. This can't be a regular array. And again, the documentation in Migrate is wrong for this. We get our unique ID. Each row that we're using for this particular plugin is uniquely identified by its fully qualified path. And then, again, this shows you what it is that we're returning here, which is the path to it, the file name, and the fully qualified path. Any questions on sources before I start moving on? Okay.
URL, does it need to be?
I can't hear you.
The URL field.
Yes.
Does it need to be a file on a file system somewhere, or can it be a dynamic URL?
Dynamic meaning?
Yeah, like a URL which is posted somewhere, which is like a web service call.
For this, that will not work because it's using the PHP file system iterators in order to walk through it. There are other ways to do that, but this is a local structure. Okay. Oh, here's the live demo that we already went through. So we looked at what the meteorites looked like and put that up on the screen. Now let's get into some processing. Processing is where the meat of your work is going to happen. This is where you're mapping data from your source to your destination, and it's where you're doing all of the manipulation and transformation of that data. You use process plugins to do that. You've got a bunch of them already, and again, Migrate Plus, as we can see here, gives you quite a lot of good ones. You can get a list of all the ones on your system using the Drupal console with a debug plugin, migrate.process plugin. where were we? Mars rovers. So let's get a migrate status here, and we can see that all of our rovers are set to 0. We haven't run these imports. We're going to run this as a group now, and what we like about groups is that if there are dependencies from one migration to the next, it will interpret these and mostly run them in order, assuming that they're all legit. When you run them one at a time, so for instance, if you run a rover photos, which has a dependency on rover, it'll just fail the migration and say that you have unmet dependencies. When you run them as a group, it will interpret it and run them in the right order. So we grabbed 3 rovers, 6 cameras, and 4 photos. Let's go and have a look at what this looks like. Here's our 4 photos. Look at that. That is what Mars looked like according to Curiosity on June 13th, 2015. We can see this came from the front hazard cam, again, for Curiosity. If we look at, oh right, I forgot to open PHP Storm. If we look at that migration, we can see what this looks like. So it's using a JSON URL feed returner. Here's the URL that it's using. We can see that we're identifying Curiosity. We're identifying this particular Earth date. I use the Earth date. This is also available by your Martian sol, which is its rotation around, but I didn't have a handy already existing Drupal element that handled those. We are going to write our pictures into public rover, and we're defining what our fields look like, so we have an idea, all of this metadata. We're processing it like so. So we're writing everything out and then building our nodes. But what we really want to pay attention to is this URLs. So there are, like I said, a couple of things in here that are that control the data that we're getting: the rover name and the date. We happen to have a form. But now that we have our rovers loaded, and we have poor Spirit who won't take, he's offline now, he doesn't take pictures more than a few years old. So let's pick opportunity this time and a date. Let's just go back to my birthday and see what Mars looked like. Now, this is actually loading up programmatically that migration object, looking at the source, changing the data that's in that source string, then it's doing its import. And here are all of the files for this rover on this date. And we can dynamically control this however we like. I'll show you what that looks like. If I can find it, because I had all this stuff open. There it is. So this is regular form, but this get migration is what it does on submit. It uses the migration plugin manager to actually retrieve an instance of this particular migration, gets the source configuration, looks at this source property, replaces each of these data points with the values from our form, and then returns it so that we can run the import. And we can do this with any combination of these settings. So if we come back to rover images, let's do Curiosity this time. Someone pick a date. It takes like 3 or 4 days to get one of these up. So something in the last couple of months. May 8th? All right, let's see what Curiosity saw on May 8th. So again, this is loading up this JSON service with our new values. It's pulling everything down, saving out all of the entities that we need, which in this case is file entities for the pictures and nodes. And in a moment, see now anytime it takes a minute to do something, I'm really worried the whole thing's going to freeze up again. Oh,
Now
boy.
this is migrating images, but we could also migrate video and audio and things like that.
Sure, anything that can become an entity. Maybe that was a busy day for rovers. Photos still importing. It's doing 113. 160. Okay, now it's done. So this is what we saw on the 8th. Look at that. That's what Mars looks like. Curiosity. We have another special treat here. So this is that CSV that we were looking at right at the beginning, and a leaflet map, because Google Maps is no longer free for the API. So of course we stopped using that. We need the free stuff. And here we have our Meteorites group, which has a fall type. There's, I was going to say, a surprising amount of pedantic detail, but it's really not surprising at all, that tracks whether a meteor was traced through the sky or found, what it's made of, what type of naming convention it is. There's a whole bunch of stuff that has to do with this. So let's import this entire group. So we're going to get all of the terms in the CSV. It's running through this CSV file 4 times. Once to get a unique set of fall types, once to get a unique set of name types, once to get a unique set of classes, and then once for each meteorite landing. Now you can actually do this all in one swoop. There's in Migrate Plus, there's a process plugin called Entity Generate, which will let you check to see if an entity exists and then create it if it doesn't. The problem with that is you can't roll it back individually. So if I use that and just did it all in one Meteorites run, and I roll Meteorites back, all of those individual terms are still there because they're part of that main migrate. They don't have their own map. So it can save some time if you're using some data source that is really big or cumbersome or really takes a long time to go through and you don't want to go through it multiple times. That is a viable option, but again, there are some penalties to pay for that. So we imported 100 meteorite landings. Now let's refresh this map. Bam! There they all are. So here we have the geo field for each one of these. We have all of our terms. Whoops, scrolling in the wrong place. And there is our map. We can roll these back. Now we go to landing sites, and they're all gone again. Okay, that was our live demos. Okay, so any questions or anything in particular we want to dissect a little more? We want to see. Sure.
I'd like to see the code for the when you're modifying and rerunning the migration through to get the new images for each date.
Oh yeah, okay. We want to see the code that changes the migration for our variable terms, variable inputs. So the first part is using the Drupal plugin service, the migration manager service, to retrieve an instance of the migration by ID. So in this case, it's rover photos. And then it looks at the source configuration and grabs this URLs property. And that is this. So apis.nasa.gov, et cetera, et cetera. So it's replacing Curiosity and Earth date equals 2015 6/3. So we're replacing these with this rover name and date, and then setting it back in there, setting that actual property on the migration itself, and then we return it. And then it's actually run right here. So this returns a migration executable. An executable has an import. Import is the function that kicks it all off and does the data manipulation. the data transfer.
So it's migration configuration entity is being read, retrieved from the database. You're doing something in memory here, so you're not actually affecting.
Correct. Yeah, I'm using the plugin manager to get an instance of it, and I'm changing the this property on that instance. And then I'm not resaving it or anything like that. I'm just executing the instance that we just changed. Yeah, so you can use something like this to write a migration to do a file import, and then have a form that uploads a file, and then every time it uploads that file, it'll just grab an instance of the migration, change the source to whatever file you just downloaded, or like into private or whatever, and then run it. Anyone else? Other questions? Sure, Brian.
It's not a question as much as a statement, I guess.
Okay, any statements?
Glad you're open to that. You mentioned that when you change the config for a migration, you have to disable and re-enable a module. That has always bugged me.
Yes.
Recently found that there's potentially another way around that. There's like the config import partial option.
I think in 8.5 that is working now. Back in 8.2, 8.3, it didn't. So the config partial, what a partial does is it will import changes without removing things that are gone. So it allegedly, you can specify a path to where the config exists, but a lot of times that doesn't work. Like I said, I don't know that I have tried it under 8.5, but I can show you all kinds of stuff where it doesn't work under prior versions. Now, Migrate Devel will actually reload the config of a migration that you're running, but only after it runs. So it can't be actually broken. It just has to not, it just, if you make your change and then do your, I think it's MIM debug. Yeah, I don't remember. So that'll show you the the source, and then it will refresh the config, but only after a run. So the next run, then it will go. So you have to run it with a limit of 1, roll it back, and then run it again. It's faster, but it's still as many commands.
Okay.
The partial stuff has been working in 8.4 for us.
Oh yeah, we can try. Let's do one.
Our use case for it was we've got distribution, and then each instance of distribution has a custom module providing entity or different content types and things like that. Sometimes they're overriding the ones that are already there, and you can't have duplicate config. If they're using the partial import, lets us have the duplicate config, and then we apply our version of it after the fact.
Okay.
And then there's also a drush command, I think it's CFRM, lets you import configuration from a specified module.
Okay, how does that work? Drush CFRM, and then I specify my module name?
I believe so, yeah. So whatever's in the install, I'm not sure if it's the optional directory also.
I don't have that.
Do you have Drush 9? Is it Drush 9?
It actually might be a contrib module that's
Okay.
writing it, I'm not sure.
So let's do this. Drush sim help. Okay, source. So let's do Lando drush sim partial source equals web/modules custom migrate PDF config install. Let's try it. Source directory does not exist.
Try to go to the Drupal root.
There we go. Oh, look at that. All right. Well, I guess let's see what they are. See if it grabbed my 2 upper. Oh, it deleted something. Well, okay, there's that. Let's see if it's uppered now. It is? Oh, this could be very exciting.
I guess this wasn't a statement as much as a request for a live demo, so.
Okay, so yes, no, that's good. Okay, so let's run this again. Oh, this would be so much better than just disabling and enabling all the time. I hate that. Refresh. Now this had better not be all uppercase. It isn't. All right. Let's give it up for Brian and Will.
That's me, one of you guys, for sure.
CFRM is provided by the config update UI module. Config update project.
This one. All right. Well, we'll play with that too. Maybe I'll write a blog post about it. All right. Any other questions? Because we are just about out of time, but I'm happy to break more stuff. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming and putting up with our weird have to restart halfway through. I appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your camp.